on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. Happy local election day. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today we'll be talking about Ukraine, Elon Musk's Twitter. We'll also be talking about what's going on, particularly with interest rates, and having a little explore into taxi regulation. It's going to be an interesting programme. Stick about after the headlines.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. There are renewed calls for the government to impose a windfall tax on energy companies after oil giant Shell reported a big increase in profits. The company revealed record first quarter profits of £7.2 billion, triple the amount it made in the same quarter last year. Surging oil and gas prices have helped offset the cost of boycotting Russian supplies. Interest rates are expected to rise to their highest in 13 years when the Bank of England announces its decision this lunchtime. The base rate is set to go from 0.75% to 1% as the bank tries to bring soaring inflation under control. Polling stations are open across the UK as millions of voters take part in the local elections today. Voters will be choosing local representatives in England, Scotland and Wales, and there will also be an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. In Ukraine, more than 300 civilians have been evacuated from the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol to the relative safety of Zaporizhia. President Zelensky is asking the UN to help ensure the safe passage of a further 200, including women and children, still trapped inside the besieged port city. The UK and Japan are set to agree on a new landmark defence agreement when the Prime Minister hosts his Japanese counterpart in London today. It follows the government's Defence and Foreign Policy Review published last year, which announced a tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. The government's being urged to reinstate a fund which helped care providers pay wages to staff while they were self-isolating. Unison and the Care Provider Alliance have written to the Health Secretary Sajid Javid. They say the decision to end the Adult Social Care COVID Fund last month was an incredibly dangerous move. TV Online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, you may have noticed that today is polling day. Across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, millions of people are heading to the polls. Now, like other broadcasters in the UK, we at GB News are by law not allowed to report details of campaigning or even election issues while people are voting. So today our programme will look at the latest on Ukraine, interest rates, a fascinating new paper about taxis and Elon Musk's Twitter. So stay tuned, we'll explore everything but the local elections. Now, MPs have asked Elon Musk to give evidence to Parliament about his plans to buy Twitter after he suggested that he wanted to charge businesses and governments to use the platform. Julian Knight, the chairman of the Digital Culture and Media and Sport Committee, wrote to Elon Musk inviting him to appear in front of MPs, wanting to hear more on verifying people's identity on the platform and, of course, boosting free speech. Julian Knight wrote, "At a time when social media companies face the prospect of tighter regulations around the world, we're keen to learn more about how Mr. Musk will balance his clear commitment to free speech with new obligations to protect Twitter's users from online harms." So, will Elon accept this kind invitation? And what do his plans mean for the website? Well, joining me now is Alan Stevens, social media and technology expert. Welcome to the programme. I suppose, first of all, the big question, the billionaire dollar question, I suppose, is will Mr Musk fly over to London to be questioned by MPs?
Well, good morning, Tom. I can't read his mind. Nobody can read Elon Musk's mind, but I'd be very surprised to see him on a plane across the Atlantic. This has happened before. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, was invited to appear. They can't be summoned, they're only invited, and just said, no, thanks, I'm too busy. And I'd be personally very surprised if Elon Musk turned up to chat to our MPs.
Yes, it does seem like it's a little bit far-fetched. Of course, the DCMS committee is not one of the most powerful committees, and you're right, can't summon those. However, they do raise some interesting questions with regard to the obligations that are being placed on social media companies in the UK, as we're seeing the passage of the Online Safety Bill, previously known as the Online Harms legislation. What effect will that have on social media companies?
Well, the idea of the Online Safety Bill is to impose more regulation so that we actually can verify people who are online, and we can hold companies to account with some pretty substantial fines if they transgress. But of course, it's only going to work if the companies cooperate. You know, we're living in a global world of social media, and we're an individual country, so we can't manage social media. All we can do is try to get cooperation. Elon Musk has already said that he's a free speech absolutionist, which kind of indicates he's going to allow anything to go on Twitter. So I'm not sure he's going to take too much notice of what our government says, but, well, time will tell, I suppose.
And that's a really interesting point, because we'll have the UK government on the one hand saying, no, you big companies, you can't do this. And on the other hand, I suppose the global companies that we rely on for so much of our communication, for our digital lives, well, they could simply just say, well, fine, we're not going to offer people in the United Kingdom our services. We'll close up shop in the UK.
Well, absolutely, Tom. I mean, interestingly, that Twitter have launched a subscription service called Twitter Blue, which they launched back in November, but they've only launched it in Australia, New Zealand, the US and Canada. They haven't launched it in Europe. And I think that may well be because they're scared about this online safety, these regulations that might come in. And therefore, we can't, we might not want to use it. We might not want to pay a bit extra for Twitter to get more features. But the fact is, it looks as though he's already trying to ignore, already trying to ignore Europe as a market.
That's really, really interesting. To some extent, we may be regulating ourselves out of the world in a similar way to, I mean, in a less extreme way to the way in which China and Russia have their own sort of separate internets. I wonder if we're setting ourselves up for quite a big fall here. I can't imagine that a government would accept a situation where some of the biggest communication platforms in the world weren't available to the people of the United Kingdom. Might this be a sort of digital Suez, where we sort of set ourselves up for a big battle and then we sheepishly withdraw?
That's a good phrase, Tom, digital Suez. I'm not sure about that. I think some countries have regulated to ban social media, certain types of social media from their borders. It's very hard to do, but some countries have tried to do it. Russia has tried to do it. Saudi Arabia has tried to do it. But I think what's happening is that we're starting to see a little bit of fragmentation. Some countries are going a certain way towards regulation. Other countries are going towards deregulation, certainly in America. And I think there will be a clash at some point. You can't resolve these issues easily because, as you rightly say, they're global. We can't force people to do something on a global scale that we want them to do nationally. So, yeah, we're going to be at a crunch point at some point fairly soon, I think.
And yet it looks like this online harms legislation is going to become law. This bill is going to become an act. Do you, in your experience, think that MPs, the people who are debating and voting on this enormous piece of legislation, actually understand what it's going to do to our internet here in the UK?
Well, we're not allowed to talk politics, so I can't really say too much today on that one. But I would say that in my experience, the level of understanding of those who, let's say, look after us at a national level is somewhat limited. And therefore, I think there's an education process to go on for people like me and people like you to actually explain to them what these implications are. They're not as fully informed as they might be, should we say.
Well, on that note, Alan Stevens, let's hope that some of them might take a break from knocking on doors this morning to have a listen to that conversation. Really, really interesting stuff. Alan Stevens there, social media and technology expert. Thanks for joining us. Now, Ukrainian soldiers are reportedly fighting bloody battles with Russian troops who have entered the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, where the city's last resistance is holding out. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky used his national address last night to plead with the UN to help save people trapped there, as official reports suggest that around 200 civilians are still sheltering inside, including 30 children. Ukraine have been supplied with numerous amounts of military aid and are expected to receive more armoured tanks from Poland. Well, we'll be talking about that story in a little moment with Robert Clark, the director of Defence and Security Unit Civitas. So we will actually be able to go to him now, I've been told. So welcome to the programme, Robert Clark. I'm glad that you can join us this morning. It does seem that we have been talking for a little while about how Russia will really step up its attacks in the east of the country. Have we reached that point?
Morning, Tom. Thank you for having me. Yes, in terms of this new front in the Donbass, which we've seen for the last 2 weeks, really there's some key battles being taken place now between Russian and Ukrainian forces, particularly around the town of Izium and further south as well in Donetsk. Now, these battles are increasingly important because this is obviously where Russia are mounting the majority of their effort now, obviously having withdrawn from the capital Kyiv around 3 to 4 weeks ago. And they're concentrating all their forces here. And what this means is, long-term, politically, it gives the opportunity for President Putin to actually declare some sort of military victory on his terms, should Russia be successful in capturing the Donbass. They've swelled to around about 90,000 troops in that area. And this is really important when we consider the forced displacement with the Ukrainian military and the refurbishment that obviously both sides are going under currently. Obviously, what's key to that is the British, American, Polish and Czech predominantly efforts to refurbish Ukrainian military hardware, whilst Russia are obviously having to rely on their own depleted Soviet-era stock, which will only last so long.
There does seem to be a bit of a movement on what the West is deciding it's able to provide Ukraine with. At the start of this conflict, we were saying defensive weaponry only the sort of weaponry that could not be viewed as offensive. Well, now people seem to be talking more about tanks, and there are even suggestions of providing NATO equipment rather than the old Soviet era equipment. What are the prospects of that?
So there's two things to really sort of discuss here. One is the NATO equipment going to Ukraine, and the other is Soviet era, like Soviet legacy era equipment going to Ukraine and is already in Ukraine. So, for example, Poland have sent around 200 T-72 tanks to Ukraine in the last sort of 4 weeks. These are Soviet era tanks. Is what the Russian army are using. And the Czech Republic have done the same. They've sent around 24, again, Soviet-era tanks. In terms of the NATO equipment, for example, with tanks, there's an understanding within the Ministry of Defence here that Britain may backfill Poland with some of our own Challenger 2 tanks. Just to be clear, these won't be going to Ukraine. These will be going to backfill Polish stocks. And the US have a similar agreement. I think they've agreed to sell to Poland around 200 Abrams tanks, again, to replenish their stocks, which have gone to Ukraine. There's several issues with this, to be fair. One is the fact that Britain have a depleted store of tanks in its own right after last year's defence review. We're still waiting for the modernised Challenger 3 tanks. So we have to be careful, really, that we're not rushing into a situation where Britain are sending over more than they can actually offer in the long term. But overall, the general picture is helping Ukraine's neighbours in order for them to backfill Ukraine's stocks with things like tanks, for instance.
It's interesting that we are looking at this backfilling situation. Obviously, the reason for that is that the Ukrainian troops are trained on the Soviet equipment and not trained are not able to use so readily more updated American or British sort of NATO equipment, tanks and the like. What is the prospect of actually training Ukrainians to use the not so much old Soviet equipment, but more modern Western equipment. Is that a possibility?
I mean, it's not just a possibility. That's happening right now. The Prime Minister announced around 2 weeks ago there's Ukrainian military members in the United Kingdom. They're training in the UK here with British military on some platforms that Britain are going to be sending out. Now, these aren't tanks. These are sort of armoured protective mobility vehicles. So, for example, the Mastiff, which I personally used in Iraq and is fantastic, and also Huskies and Foxhounds. Now, these aren't tanks. These provide armoured mobility, like I said, to Ukrainian forces. So it'll help them in their manoeuvres and the pitch battles that we're seeing right now with the Donbass. So these vehicles and the Ukrainian trainers will go back through Poland to Ukraine, and there they'll be utilised in battle. So this is happening right now as we speak.
That's really interesting. It does suggest that potentially the West genuinely believes the Ukrainians have a chance here of winning. In your view, Robert Clark, what is the likelihood that Ukraine might actually be able to push Russia out of their country altogether?
Oh, sure. I mean, this is the crux of the conversation now. We're in a position where potentially 6 to 8 weeks ago we didn't think was realistically possible. I mean, we're not only talking about the Russian defeat around Kyiv, we're looking at Russian losses in the Donbass. It's incredibly early days in the Donbass, for instance, to draw predictions. However, we can see the Russian military weakness. They are failing to learn from their earlier losses in terms of leadership, command and control, and mission command, sort of delegation to subordinates. And these are leading to increased Russian losses. In terms of the possibility for Ukraine to actually win decisively in the Donbass and elsewhere in Ukraine, it's a distinct possibility, particularly with the uplift and the continued uplift in Western military aid. And not only that, we're also looking at a possibility where Ukraine could even go on the counter-attack and retake lost ground since 2014. So, for example, the Crimea. Now, this would be quite dangerous regarding a Russian escalation where it could potentially lead to, I spoke on your show only a few days ago, potentially with nuclear or chemical attacks by Russia if they feel boxed in almost militarily. But in terms of the options for Ukraine, we're in a position where we didn't really think possible 6 to 8 weeks ago. And it is certainly a likelihood that they could ultimately prove decisive. It's just how long will that take to get there?
That is the most remarkable turnaround from the start of this invasion. The resilience of the Ukrainian forces has been incredible to see. Well, thank you so much for talking us through those issues there, Robert Clark, Director of the Defence and Security Unit at Civitas, of course. Thanks for joining us this morning. Well, now it's time we look over current taxi cab regulations as we all get moving again after COVID. New data suggests that licensed taxis have been decreasing since 2011, leading to a decline in the freedom of movement of people and having a negative impact on the nighttime economy. A new report from the Adam Smith Institute argues that the government should move to overhaul current taxi cab legislation, aiming to reduce costs with a more liberal licensing system. Well, what's this all about? Joining me now is the author of the report, Maxwell Marlow, researcher at the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome to the programme, Maxwell. First of all, what are the problems with how we regulate taxis as things stand?
Morning, Tom. There are a few problems with the way in which we regulate our taxis. In the UK, we have 316 different licensing authorities spread throughout the country, all of which have very different ways of basically cracking down and securing licenses for different types of vehicles. The issue is, of course, that those regulations differ from borough to borough, and they cause a lot of problems and a lot of waste, and we really need to fix that now.
When we're looking at the waste, it's mainly in terms of the sheer cost, potentially, in terms of someone actually getting a licence in the first place. Is that right? In terms of, particularly in London, where to get a licence to drive a taxi cab, you sort of need to spend almost £10,000.
Absolutely, yeah. We're seeing these statistics all over London, for example. It's not just the £10,000, it's the 3 or 4 years you spend going around London, learning the streets off by heart. And, the first test when you do the knowledge has a 99% fail rate. How is that sustainable? There's so much waste there, and it really pushes prices up, and it's no reason why those taxi driver numbers have been falling. So why have the knowledge when we have these fantastic things on our phones, like GPS systems, which keep constant updates about traffic, congestion, roadworks, some things the knowledge just can't prepare you for. It can't make you see into the future. So why on earth are we keeping this in the regulatory system? That's kind of what our paper's about.
So potentially losing that old London institution of the knowledge, or maybe I'm sure that many taxi drivers would like to have it anyway, but not all of them would under your proposals. Would London lose something in its character if that were to take place?
I don't really think it would, to be honest. I know there's much to be said about these old institutions and how great they are, but the thing is that the world moves on. The same argument would have been said, 100 years ago. Would London lose its character of the old stables and the horses? Well, really? I'm not too sure about that. So I think we need to be looking forward, in our view, for a future of mobility and really making sure that we're not held back by some of these old, very expensive and now just ludicrous and outdated traditions.
And do you think that there's potentially room to move here? Now that everyone's talking about the cost of living crisis, now that people are really concerned about the pounds in our pockets, is now a time where liberalisation of this sort may be more possible than in years previous?
Absolutely. Let's look at the 3 lowest income households, right? The lowest, of course, down in the bottom decile, only 30% of them own a car, and that's a real issue if we really want to talk about people going and choosing where they want to work and spending time with their family, going around. Private hire vehicles, ride sourcing vehicles, they provide this sort of accessibility that people deserve to have. Not to mention Deloitte did a report in Australia about ride sourcing vehicles and found that it unlocked about $80 million in growth, and that was only a few years after new legislation came in. Think about the massive scale in which investment can just be pushed into the country through proper reforms, centralised, liberalised, transparent reforms.
And yet we look at the minicab industry, where the regulation has been very much going in the opposite direction in the last 5 years, where ride-sharing apps have become, frankly, harder to use and more expensive. Is that due to regulation?
It's down to a few different costs. Regulation is definitely one of them. We also have to remember that a lot of these ride-sharing apps have huge amounts of equity behind them. They're basically discounting fares. However, we have just seen Uber produce one of their first profits, which is really exciting news, and we're definitely going to see some changes about that. But nonetheless, regulation is still a big problem in our industry. Uber has had 20,000 fewer drivers, which of course keeps supply low and demand is ever growing, pushing that price up. So if we deregulate the way in which we have people come in and drive on our roads for a service that we all choose and we all love, those Ubers, Bolts, Lyfts, Gets, whatever, if we can change that kind of market movement, we can bring those costs down and even put more money in the pockets of people who are driving these cars.
That's really interesting, particularly in the context of this cost of living crisis. Just finally, in the last 30 seconds of this conversation, how likely is it, do you think, that politicians may take up your proposals?
Well, I should hope they do. The Department for Transport has just issued a consultation for best practice guidance, so we're hoping to look at that, and we've had a fantastic MP on the Transport Select Committee who's endorsed our report, so let's hope he wants to tell his colleagues a little bit more about that. It'll be difficult, but, we're not afraid of that at the Adam Smith Institute.
Well, Maxwell Marlow, thank you so much for talking us through that really interesting area of regulation there, researcher at the Adam Smith Institute, of course. Well, now, regular GB News viewers will know that our very own Gloria De Piero does a series of Real Me interviews with MPs, getting behind the politics to find more about the person. Well, today, Gloria talks to Labour MP and Shadow Minister Peter Kyle. He's 51 but has a reading age of 8 and was diagnosed as dyslexic in his late 20s. School was tough for him and one teacher was especially cruel. Let's have a listen.
There's one moment where a teacher stood up and we were in English and we were doing Shakespeare, and suddenly, even though we weren't reading aloud, and we were just reading the text and talking about the text, the teacher suddenly said, "Peter, why don't you just stand up and read this chapter?" And I was so shocked because the teacher would have known full well that I wasn't capable of doing it, and asked me to do so. And the teacher was falling about laughing as I was doing it one word at a time with the pause and getting words wrong. But I remember very well looking around the room, and there was a couple of kids who were sniggering, but most of the kids were with me. You know, they were as humiliated as I was. But that was the moment that I just switched off education. I just realised that I'm going to turn up, I'm going to get out as quickly as I can, but that's just not for me. So that is the moment. You know, when you say a long time ago, so many of those memories will have dimmed, they have. But when you are humiliated, that's something that stays with you for life.
Really powerful stuff there. You can watch that interview in full with Peter Kyle at 12:35 today. It's an inspiring story. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning. Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Still a bit fresh out there first thing this morning, but things warming up a little bit by this afternoon. Certainly where we see some sunshine, feeling warmer than yesterday. A dry day for most, but not everywhere. High pressure is controlling the weather across the southern half of the UK, but notice there are weather fronts further north, already bringing some rain to the northwest of Scotland, and I suspect the Highlands, the Western Isles, staying fairly dull and damp all day. Rain at times over the Northern Isles. One or two showers elsewhere through Scotland, but I suspect most of the south of Scotland through the central belt will be dry. The odd shower for Northern Ireland, perhaps across England and Wales. It might see one or two showers this afternoon, but for the vast majority, it's dry. Yes, often fairly cloudy, but where the sun comes out, feeling warmer than yesterday, 18, 19, 20, 21, maybe a touch higher in one or two parts of the south. Cooler where we've got that more persistent rain, which will continue through this evening across the Highlands and the Western Isles. And if anything, this rain kind of organises itself into a line. We've got a weather front which will bring more persistent rain, slowly heading south towards the central belt and across Northern Ireland during the early hours. So a wetter start to tomorrow here. Again, for most of England and Wales, dry overnight, maybe turning a little misty in places and temperatures down into single figures. But a different feel for Friday, certainly across Scotland, Northern Ireland, a wet start, and that rain will push southwards. So it could turn heavy as it turns up across parts of northern England and Wales. One or two scattered showers in the south, but again for much of southern England, the Midlands, eastern England, a dry day, but predominantly cloudy. Brighter skies for Scotland and Northern Ireland by tomorrow afternoon, some sunshine and just one or two showers. A fresher feel here, again for most places, temperatures in the mid to high teens. There are signs of things warming up, however. Those weather fronts slip away during Friday night. High pressure moves in for the weekend, bringing most places a dry and a fine weekend, and signs of things turning warmer still next week.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.